Hello, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dave Reed. I'm the Program Director here at the Leading Edge Forum. I'd like to welcome all of our clients and friends. It's good to be with you again today. I hope you're all well. And to those of you that don't know us, the Leading Edge Forum is a research and advisory group where we really specialize in helping business executives see what's coming at them on the horizon and help them accelerate the business change that they get from technology related initiatives. And in today's short webinar, acknowledging the situation really that we all find ourselves in today, we're going to do something a little daring and take a glimpse at what we think the world is going to look like post the coronavirus pandemic. We at the LEF have a belief that the digital economy will shift really from a position of reshaping the world more to a position of being reshaped by the world. And to address this topic today in our webinar, I'm going to introduce shortly David Moschella. Dave is a research fellow here at the Leading Edge Forum. Prior to that, he was our research director, and prior to that, led IDC's global research function. In Dave's latest book, Seeing Digital, he has pointed back to many of the changes that have happened over the last couple of decades that have really shaped the world that we're in today. And it's really great for us that Dave has made most of those calls absolutely bang on. So I can't actually think of anyone better to lead us through the discussion today. So just before Dave starts, I just want to say that we're going to be doing some Q&A as part of the discussion today. So for those of you that are familiar with Zoom, if you just submit your Q&A through the function at the bottom of the screen, once Dave's finished his insights, we'll be putting discussion points to Dave and get some discussion going. So without any further ado, Dave, why don't you take us away?
Thanks, Dave, and hello, everybody. Nice to join you. Thanks for being with us, and hope you're all safe and well wherever you are, as I am here in Boston. You know, when we started thinking about doing this session, we had two main questions. The first was one of timing. When do we want to do this? You know, most of the people listening to the call today are either in the US or the UK, and obviously we're both going through some sort of peak problems of this whole virus situation. So we wanted to try to time it in a way that at least when people could start to look at what might be lying ahead. And I think we're sort of at that point now where at least we can take a glimpse at things. But the second question we had was actually, well, what is it we're going to say? We've all been listening to COVID-19 talks for a long time now, 24/7, people commenting on it. What is it that the LEF can add to the conversation that will help you all? And that was really my challenge today, is to try to figure out ways to use our research to help think through this situation. And you know, someone asked me quite bluntly, they said, well, what are you going to say about this? And I said, well, the one thing we're clearly going to say is that our industry has gone used to thinking in terms of digital disruptions and how digital technologies are reshaping the world. But it's very clear if you look at the situation today that the big disruptions are coming from the outside world with the virus. That's clear. But actually, from a technology point of view, our industry is actually helping us sustain and stabilize things much more than it is disrupting them. And that sort of shift, that inversion, we think is relevant to a lot of ways to talk about all this. And again, that's what I'm going to try to do. And I'm going to try to do it by looking at five main areas and sort of walk through them to give you our thinking. The first of them is this whole thing with the tech lash. And those of you who know LEF work know that for a long time, really since 2018, and we have been writing about how, although all these issues of concerns, as you see listed on the right side of the screen, are very real and come with these powerful technologies, the fear, the anger, the anxiety, we've always thought were quite highly exaggerated. And I think, if nothing else, the current period has shown that to be true. And that's really what you're seeing on the slide here, that shown that, if you look at the tech services that are currently being provided, and no secrets to any of those, and that list of 10 sort of roughly ranked by me in some order of priority. And you see all the important things that the internet has been used for over the last few months. And you say, well, how does that compare to these concerns? Well, to me, it's pretty clear that they're actually infinitely greater in importance than those things listed on the right. And, I think that is clear as you look at those individual ones as well. If you look at the ones highlighted there in bold, privacy has been such a big issue. Even in Europe today, in Brussels, the heart of the EU, people are starting to wonder, well, contact tracing, we actually can't do that very well because it conflicts with the strict rules we have about privacy. Fears of automation don't look so good when the fact of automated services to buy groceries or pay bills or whatever are so critical to just continuing through this period. Monopoly power of the tech giants. Well, having the heart of our companies be big, strong, powerful companies with plenty of cash in the bank suddenly looks like a really good thing, because that's one area that will not fall short in delivering things. And on down the line, fear of AI and robots. Well, yes, but AI clearly is going to, machine learning in particular, will play an important role in the therapeutics, in the hunt for the vaccine, and all ways of analyzing symptoms, all kinds of very important ways in coping with the current situation. And even fake news, which people have talked about so much. If you look on balance, is the internet contributing to fake news or real news in this situation? I think it's very, very clear it's the latter. So you have all of these things sort of shrinking in importance. And then you have really the very strong performance of our industry. Let's face it, the internet has dealt with a huge increase in scale and usage in a relatively, very smooth area. There have been some outage problems, some bandwidth problems, but not a lot. And what this has meant to all of the areas listed there on the left is enormous. And so the bottom line here is that, the internet is the one thing that the virus really can't touch. It functions quite well during all this period. And no matter what you think of those 10 issues on the right, they will all continue. They are all important. They're all ones that society will continue to debate. But I think what we've seen happen, we'll take some of the sting and some of the vitriol out of it, because in the end, people can see that technology has been an enormous benefit through this period. And you just simply ask yourself, so where would we be without it if we go back to a world of telephones and fax machines and such? And it's just a remarkably good story. That said, I think the tech industry could still do more. And it would be nice to see, for example, the internet billionaires opening up their wallets more to take care of their people. And there are many more things that the tech industry can do to provide services to the public. But on balance, I think this should, at least in all probability, take the steam out of the techlash and put these issues into a much more realistic perspective. So I think that's very much a good thing that might come out of all this.
Dave, just sorry to interrupt you there. Could you just move perhaps a little closer to the mic? We've just had a couple of requests for volume up, if that's okay. Thanks, Dave.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. That's good to know. Hopefully that's a little bit better. I'll get closer and adjust the cameras and all. Cool. So yes, hopefully you can all hear me a little bit better now. And so, anyways, the putting the techlash in perspective seems like a very significant thing and a useful thing. But in the real world, some other things are happening, and just walk through the other themes that we're sort of seeing. The second is just the way that societal attitudes and behavior have changed in a quite short period of time. You know, in the tech industry, we all know what the phrase digital first means, but most of the people in the world today, that didn't really have any great meaning at all. But now that we're in a world that is sort of more like digital only, everybody has sort of a sense of what we mean here. And you see how people's behavior has changed, first often out of necessity, but then we think increasingly out of choice in the way that we now talk to our doctors, the way we might talk to our physical trainers, or the way we might take lessons. A colleague of mine, his son takes piano lessons, and they've suddenly started to do them virtually, and they both realize that this is perfectly good, this is perfectly fine, this can be quite convenient for all of us. So the habits have changed, and I think very much many millions of people have developed new skills, habits, expectations, and trust and behavior that has accelerated the overall digitalization of the world. And then so that's three positive ones. On sort of a more negative note, it's very clear that globalization has taken another big hit, not just because of all the things about China that we will certainly talk about, but even in Europe and in countries, Italy and Spain, and all around the world, many countries just feeling like, well, it's every nation for itself in trying to get through this thing. So some big shifts there as well. But those first four are sort of ones that I think are probably pretty obvious to the group. The last three below are ones that that we need to think about sort of more from a long-term point of view. And so the first one there, will the big tech giants increasingly be seen as essentially national utilities? I know the Economist magazine has been writing about this a good bit, and rightly so. And you think back, and there was a time when companies like AT&T and British Telecom were almost part of the government. They were so vital to the services of the world. And are the tech companies going to start to play that role and be seen in that way? And we think that's quite an interesting issue for us to follow. And even more sort of interesting to think through is, people are now starting to ask themselves directly, why is it that so much of Asia has managed this problem so much better than Europe and the US? We all probably saw that Wuhan really fully opened up yesterday, but it's not just China, it's South Korea, it's Hong Kong, it's Taiwan, it may be Singapore. The results are significantly better than we see in the US and certainly in most of Europe. Germany's obviously done a little bit better than others, but there's a huge difference in how this has been managed. And as we get to the bottom of that, it's going to lead to some conclusions about quite a few things, I suspect. So a real change in certain thinking is probably likely there. And then last on that list there, attitudes, government spending, and UBI, universal basic income. For a long time, governments have said, well, we can't spend money on this or that because we don't have it. But in the US, they just suddenly came up with $6.2 trillion. And in Spain, they're rolling out UBI type thinking and programs now. And so these sort of traditional views are clearly changing in ways that could lead to all sorts of different fiscal situations in the coming months and years. So thinking has changed. We'll see how much it lasts, but you can see some different sort of paradigms and mental models emerging. And we think you see the same thing when you start to look at things from a more economic point of view. And here we have the same pattern. The first four of these are ones that you probably know fairly well. The last three, more things for us all to think about. But the first one is, I think, is a clear one, that during such times, strong tend to get stronger. We saw this in the financial crisis with the banks, but now we see it across many more sectors, hotels, airlines, and such things. So you do tend to see the winning out of the weaker players during such times. That seems pretty clear. Second, and probably more interesting for a lot of companies, is that there is right now this systematic rethinking of value chains centered on the user need for safety. You know, those of you who know the LEF might be familiar with our whole process of Wardley mapping, of value chain mapping, the way we try to map out the evolution of value chains over time. And that's clearly happening right now as safety becomes the predominant user need. And, you know, everybody's been dealing with that on a sort of ad hoc basis so far, but now you try to really systematize that and prepare for the future. Similarly, and I talked about this earlier, attitudes towards automation. Those of you who see LEF research probably know that we wrote a paper last fall called The Automation Imperative that talked about the long-term need for automation so that society could slowly shift resources to many new challenges that are clearly there, and would urge you all to check out that paper. But during this time, automation has clearly become a short-term imperative as well, to continue operations, to process payments, to deliver groceries, to provide self-service and mirror the physical world in all of these ways. So, you know, automation is clearly getting a major boost through this. And again, maybe a negative, maybe a change, but from more of a global point of view, an increased emphasis on self-sufficiency, and the shortages that we've had, you know, often do stem from the fact that we don't make a lot of this stuff and are dependent on foreign suppliers in Asia and elsewhere. And whether this will lead to larger inventories or not remains to be a question. So, yeah, those four are probably things that you all are familiar with. The last three are ones that we sort of think about from a leading edge research point of view. And the first one of those I think is quite interesting is, you know, people have talked about how difficult it is to decarbonize. And then suddenly in a couple of months, we did it. You stop flying, you stop driving so much, you stop lots of things. And the amount of carbon goes down far sharper than anybody was talking about before this situation. But of course, you have to ask yourself at what price, not just the damage to the travel and entertainment and other industries in the airlines, but also just the enormous increase in paper and plastic packaging that's coming for all the deliveries that we get and the problems that sort of loom there. So decarbonization has gotten real in a very significant way, and how that's seen will be interesting going forward. The second one, and sort of a pet issue of mine, is that when you really look at the issues of automation and AI, probably the most likely areas to be affected are, in fact, large office buildings full of white-collar workers, and office space being the canary in that coal mine. And a lot of companies that I think are sort of realizing that, hey, we're actually do pretty well with more people working at home, and do we really need all this space? And who knows what will happen, but just sort of a psychic fundamental devaluation of office space seems to be really likely going forward. And the last one I think is important, that to me, I've often wondered, you know, how much do I really care about driverless cars and trucks? I like the driverless car when I get really old and can't drive anymore. But in the short term, I didn't really care that much. But they sure would be handy now. You know, where I live in Boston, they're actually doing a curfew between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Imagine streets filled with, you know, driverless vehicles making deliveries through all that time. Much easier in terms of all the traditional challenges of the driverless industry, and enormous benefits in these sort of isolation and pandemic times. So probably a boost for that industry, and you can certainly see China and others taking that possibility to heart. So we think all these effects will linger, some in the short term, some in the longer one. So just two more along these lines that Next, we're looking really at particular businesses and this whole issue of resiliency. And when we look at, in some ways, it's traditional business resiliency, the continuity, the backup, the recovery, knowing who's available to work, working from home, having good information. All these things are ones that we're very familiar with and are part of the CIO and COO and CFO agenda. And in this period, they've just been extended and expanded like never before, but they're sort of familiar issues to a lot of our people within IT. But the virus also brings a lot of unique things, and that's shown on the second half. And the first is sort of in the middle there, you see sort of the three steps that most companies we've seen have gone through. The first is, how do you manage the shock and just sort of understand and deal with the moment? Second, how do you adjust your operations to cope with what you see? And then some sort of process of learning and transformation to build in these capabilities more systematically so that if it happens again, people will be better prepared, because it may well happen again. We've seen warnings of MERS and SARS and Ebolas and Zikas and mad cow. We've seen many of these things that didn't turn out to be quite so bad, and now we see one that did. But it probably suggests that this won't be the last one. So the learnings we have here do seem to have value going forward. And again, we have this sort of larger question. Are we going to see some sort of more fundamental change in business from sort of this, as we say there, from some sort of focus on the me and us to the we in a more social form of resiliency? And clearly you're seeing that all around the US, UK, and elsewhere, with the emphasis on safety and trust and repurposing activities for the public good and working with governments and all that. And we all know that. But the one that really sticks in my mind is the one having to do with employees. After 9/11, everybody really appreciated what the police and the fire people did when they embraced that challenge and really ran to the work that was needed to be done. And of course, people see that now with the healthcare workers on a much, much more numerous scale and in many ways equally risky. But you also see it far more than that, in addition to that, with all the workers in Amazon, in the supermarkets, in the driver companies, and all that. And you see this quite odd and somewhat troubling split in that, in many ways, the people who can work at home are the ones who are least affected by this, who tend to be also the most better off, and some of the less well off are the ones most exposed in doing this essential work. And this, we think, will be an enormous lesson for the Amazons and the Walmarts and others. And it really does seem to be putting a lot of spotlight on that the frontline workers of all sorts and how they are thought of and how they are rewarded versus those of us who have the luxury of doing things like this. And the public pressure that does seem to be coming with that. And the companies that have had missteps here, whether it's a Waitrose or a football club or whatever, seem to get punished quite quickly. So who knows what will really happen here, how big the challenges will be. If you put on a more skeptical hat, you'd say, a lot of that stuff, come togetherness of 9/11 and 7/7 and other things, it actually wore off pretty quickly and we went back to norm, and perhaps that'll happen again. But at least for now, there's a real spotlight on some of the most important and people we're dependent on for whatever reasons, being on the lower wage end of the economy, and how that will play out. Certainly from a social point of view is an important issue. And last on this list, and really the one that's probably closest to my own research, is this basic question of disruptions. And again, we've grown used to thinking about digital disruptions. And you see all those lists of things there on the right, powerful technologies that really can change many things. But I think it's also very fair to say that if you look at those exogenous disruptions, those external shocks, those ones listed on the left there, it's hard not to argue that those 10 things are fundamentally much more powerful than the digital ones. So, when we start to think about disruption, digital disruptions become a subset, or perhaps even a very small subset of the larger changes that are going on in the world. And won't go through all these 10, and I think they're very clear to all of you. But just take the first one. Do we want to decouple from China? It's the biggest market in the world, and so it's hard to do that. But the dependency we've had has become very clear to all, and how that plays out across supply chains and trade wars and labor and shortages and all these things are all there. And not to mention, climate change, which many still would say is the biggest disruptor at all, but a longer term one that it's harder for it to get the short term attention. But the basic message here is that you now have this combination of external disruptions combined with the digital ones, and that sort of interplay between the two is sort of what we want to research. And it means you have to get more into some of these more larger current events issues than just the technologies per se. And it just says to one example of that, we could do this for any industry, but look at the insurance industry where they face this situation. All manner of potential digital disruptions on the left. I mean, an industry that grew up with the agent broker culture, perhaps having someday a direct connection to the customer, all the things about algorithms and the ability to predict outcomes based on machine learning and individual traits and behavior, all these sort of digital things that could change the way that the insurance industry works. But then you compare them to what's really going to happen. We have these sort of natural disasters and diseases and viruses totally change the economics of healthcare or life or property insurances, and whether those independent businesses can even stand. In America today, the COVID situation has essentially been nationalized, and they basically just bypassed the private insurance industry and said, well, everything will be free and covered in some way. So you have the big external disruptions, and then you have the big digital ones. And if you had to say, over the course of the 2020s, you'd probably say those exogenous ones are the bigger ones. And that's a different mindset than we had certainly in the early parts of this century in terms of technology. So that's sort of the 5 areas that I wanted to cover. I'll just close before we set up the Q&A with this one. Originally, we were going to do a poll to get your own views of these 5 questions, but Zoom actually disabled the poll function yesterday, and you can give them some slack there. Unbelievable how much they've had to scale. A company that's been around for 9 or 10 years that people didn't really even know is suddenly part of our life in so many ways. But we thought we'd leave the slide up there anyways, because it summarizes what I've been talking about, the end of the tech flash, the changes in attitudes, the impact of the isolation of the economy over the longer term, the need for this societal and business resilience, and this whole changing way that we think about disruptions in terms of external versus digital. Those are sort of the key themes. We also just thought it would be an easy way to open up to you all for any questions about these or other issues. And to moderate that Q&A part of this, I'm going to turn things over to Dave Reed, but thanks for listening to me, and look forward to your questions. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Just a reminder to folks, you can submit your questions via the Q&A button on the bar at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. A couple in, Dave. I'm just going to put the first one up there to you now. As the crisis unfolds, zombie companies will begin to fail, and there'll be a consolidation of technological expertise. These organizations will bring forward automation. More automation means more data, big data to train new machine learning models. Do you agree this will lead to a flywheel effect that will accelerate automation and AI innovation, an area I know is close to your interest?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that will happen. certainly within the tech industry itself. And there are all kinds of commentaries about how many of the once and would-be unicorns are struggling and are now up for sale. And it's fairly easy to see an Amazon or Microsoft swallowing up those organizations, incorporating them, and further industrializing their offerings. And again, with the strong getting stronger. So we certainly see this in our own industry. And we would have seen some of it anyways, but it will accelerate. And I think the same pattern is probably true in other industries as well, that it is always the case that in times of major changes, the strong get stronger. So yeah, and that was well stated.
Great, thanks, John, for that question. Another one come in, Dave. What are the hallmarks of a resilient organization in comparison to a fragile one, and what should businesses be doing during a crisis like this to develop the resiliency, or is it perhaps too late?
Well, it almost certainly is too late for this particular crisis. That if you haven't been able to cope with it so far, you've probably lost ground to companies that have, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it is quite late in the game. But you can see that the companies that can operate in a cloud virtual mode with very limited visible impact to their customers or even their employees have tremendous advantages. I mean, look at the grocery industry today. Who can deliver groceries and who can't? These things will be etched into people's minds. And if there's one opportunity in all this, there's no question that the companies that survive and serve best through this period, that their brands will be enhanced and that their customers will remember, and vice versa.
Yeah, no, indeed. And a few more coming in now, Dave. Thanks for that one. Dave, one in from Mark. Hello, Mark. Given that nations are more aligned to open markets such as the EU and US, do you think the government, do you see government creating enabling boundaries such as regulations that require certain resiliencies like supply chains and business continuities so that we can ensure the level of resilience overall goes up?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question though that those words are very much out there right now, and that everybody is talking about stockpiles and preparing and readiness. And in the U.S., the way that is often stated is that we spend close to somewhere around $700 billion every year on national defense, but we spend a tiny fraction on national defense in this sort of virus context. And when people look at that, it no longer makes a lot of sense. And one thing, I'll just speak from an American point of view, one thing we pretty much always do is after one of these things, we plow a lot into fighting the last battle. And if you look at after 9/11, the enormous amount of resources that were made available to many things, some wise and some less wise, you see that now, that resources are being allocated at just an enormous level. So yeah, you certainly see that here. You're going to see it everywhere. And when I look at Europe, you look at the people in Italy and Spain in particular, they feel like, hey, Europe isn't helping me here. This is Italy, this is Spain, and we can't even count on what we thought we could count on. And so I think the popular nationalism, whatever you want to call it, those things have been strengthened too.
Yeah, I'd concur. I mean, from a European perspective, I think we've actually created boundaries by closing the borders to restrict movement in a way, and that's both symbolic and been done for good reasons in terms of containment. On a related note, Dave, in terms of questions, there's one here around employment curve. What will the employment curve look like in the next 5 years? We've seen a big spike, clearly, I think, notably in the US, hit the headlines recently. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have any great insight into that. The only I would say from a U.S. point of view is, things were in very, very good shape until this happened, and the government is spending an enormous amount of money to sort of kickstart things whenever that becomes possible. And I think those are grounds for optimism. But it's hard to avoid the view that there will at least be temporarily a spike in unemployment. It's funny though. Amazon apparently is hiring 100,000 people. The healthcare industry is hiring enormous amounts of people, and so flexibility in jobs and in markets is an important part of this. And you can see some rebalancing of things as some of the older businesses do shrink in importance. But I don't know. I think if you look at the shocks we've had in the past, 9/11 and such things, which is different, but probably the most directly comparable. A lot of things shut down, a lot of short-term things, but economies are resilient, and I think people and societies are resilient. So I think there will be some hits, but I think people are up to the task, and I think it's more of a health problem than an economic one in the bottom line.
Sure. So on a related question, we have one in from Sandra. Thank you, Sandra. The need for respiratory machines shows the criticality of the global value chain. A device, for example, needs 621 parts delivered by many partners. Nationalism is thriving in healthcare, but also economical ?
Yeah, I think this is, if you want to talk about a big disruption, it's nationalism versus global supply chain / Asia / China dependency. And we went very far along that ladder path over the last 20, 30 years. And now that is swinging back. And, but swinging back is going to be very, very, very difficult. And I think that is going to be a source of problem. The reality is that making a lot of those components and those things competitively in the US, in the UK, is not going to be easy. For issues of speed and volume and cost structures and all of those things. And so decoupling, as people call it, from Asia is not going to be a simple thing. And it's particularly difficult when China, in many cases, is your largest market. People look at Apple and they say, well, why doesn't Apple speak out on issues related to China? Well, they really can't speak out because it's not just that they're dependent on China get so many of the things made and built, it's because they sell more phones in China than anywhere else. And when you add those two things together, it's very hard to decouple. So there's a lot of talk about self-sufficiency and sovereignty and nationalism now, and there'll be movement in that direction, but I do not think it's going to be that easy to fully do it. And so I think in some sort of rapprochement or some sort of sort of globalization light seems more likely.
Yeah, sure. On a slightly different tack, we've got planning just another maybe 5 minutes of questions, everyone, before we finish. Just one in from Diane. Thanks, Diane. A slightly different angle. Will social distancing morph to long-term social sparsity, requiring entertainment and travel venues and conferences to find ways to long-term reduce the number of people participating in events at one time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I started going to Asia fairly often in the 80s and 90s. At that point, most of the Asian societies never liked to shake hands, and they would bow or do the Indian Namaste sign or whatever they did. But they actually started shaking hands because the more powerful Western businesses did that. And now you can start to see those sort of dynamics shifting the other way. And I do think that there will be some behavioral changes, whether they extend to audiences in conferences and seating in restaurants. That remains to be seen, but I think at least temporarily you will see steps there and then people will adjust. But the Western model of hugs and handshakes is clearly going to be challenged.
Indeed, indeed. As we think at the LAF about adjusting our own events as well, it's very real for us all right now. Just a couple more come in, Dave. I'll just push through these. As companies realize the benefits and feasibility of being remote, how should firms begin thinking about ongoing professional development, training, and employee benefits post-COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if companies believe that they can work just as well with people at home, in theory, that saves money in office spaces, which in theory makes money available to make sure people have a good setup at home. But most of us probably more or less already do, and so I don't think the investment there in kit and hardware is that important. The LAF itself is a virtual org where hardly any of us are ever in an office, and you can function quite well there. The biggest challenges you often have is with new people, because they're not having physical proximity to your new colleagues is different. But even there, you can get through it. So I personally believe that there are too many people in offices, and that you will see a shrinkage there over time, and that technology will drive that. And the pace of that is unknown, but it's the sort of thing that for us it'd be a good thing to research.
Absolutely. Just two more, Dave, and then we will close. Do you see a trend towards greater support for collective bargaining, or a new version of such for frontline workers taking hold, or is there more likely that concerns from them are a sympathetic short-term response?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the folks at Amazon and the Whole Foods supermarket version of Amazon here in the U.S., they put the fear of the public when they threatened to have a walkout right now because they didn't think they were being protected well and paid well enough. And they had a good case, but the pressure to work overrode that. And whether they are unionized or simply treated and paid better by companies that in many ways simply can afford to, certainly the big tech companies can, I think there will be a push there. But as the questioner asked, these things do often just wear off, and it is possible it will. The firefighters and the police and all that, people are still thanking them for their service in 9/11 20 years later. And I think they did get more benefits, respect, and better pay. And so I think we'll see at least some positive movement there. I think it was needed before, and it's more needed now. And I think it will happen because companies are being called to account. I had an artist friend of mine who months ago needed some extra money and took a job just to make some cash at a supermarket. All of a sudden he finds himself in a front line dangerous position. It's like, oh, that's not what I bargained for when I took a relatively low wage job. And you multiply that by millions. And so, yeah, I do. I think that will be a movement. The U.S. may or may not lead that movement. History says probably not, but it certainly exists on both sides of the pond.
Okay, that's great. And one final question, Dave, before we just close up here. In from Andy. Thanks, Andy. What could COVID-19 make possible that wasn't possible before, in your view?
Yeah, I would go back to, I think it makes a highly automated virtual economy far more accelerated and likely than where we were before, because it has turned that vision from one of mostly fear and worry to one of necessity and comfort. And so as businesses move in that path, they're going to feel better about it, and the markets feel better about it. And so I think for the pace of digital change and adoption, and as we say, industrialization, the really hardening of these systems and technologies is going to get a really, really big boost. And certainly even more so in China, where that lesson's been really taken to heart already.
Yeah. And I would just add that I think the world has been talking about digital transformation for a long time now, as we well know, and perhaps one of the things that this may accelerate and enable is actually some true transformation in organizations as we reflect and hopefully recover.
That's the
Okay.
same we do, yeah.
Indeed. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I don't want to keep everyone for the full hour. We've run for 45 minutes. My gift to you will be 15 minutes back in your busy schedules today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. If you have submitted a question that I haven't responded to, we will do so after the event. Just to say, in terms of how we can help you at the LAF, what Dave has just described is written on a commentary that's available on our website for you all to digest. We think a lot about these scenarios, what it means for various industries. So if you are interested in a discussion with us about what this might mean for your industry or organization post the pandemic, please get in touch. And indeed, we have some workshops available to our clients, digital business leadership, for example, that address this very, very succinctly. So I'll leave it there. We will send out a PDF to everybody just with all of this information on it. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay safe, everybody, and we'll speak again soon on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.